I thought it might be helpful, because probably very few of you have any idea who I am, to spend a couple of minutes talking about who I am and how I got here. I'm a sociologist, but I'm a little bit unusual for a sociologist in that I actually started out life as a physicist many years ago back in Australia, and I did my undergraduate degree in physics and wrote my thesis on what was then a very hot topic called chaos theory. And then a couple of years later, I moved over here to the States and went to do my PhD at Cornell University. Then I switched to the engineering department, and I ended up writing my PhD dissertation on a topic that was not yet a hot topic, but has subsequently become very, very hot, that of social networks. And then inspired by that experience, I decided to become, of all things, a sociologist. And after a few years sort of mucking around with various research stints at Columbia and this place called the Santa Fe Institute, which is an institute in Santa Fe, and MIT, I ended up at Columbia University teaching sociology for several years. And then just as I was getting comfortable calling myself a sociologist, I joined Yahoo, where I now work with almost exclusively computer scientists in their research lab. So the reason why I'm telling you this is because all of this sort of toing and froing around the disciplines from physics to sociology and then back to engineering again has given me sort of both an insider and an outsider perspective on what sociology is and what sociologists do. And I've sort of thought about this a lot over the years, and it really sort of has led me to think a lot about this question, which is why don't we think about the kinds of problems that sociologists study the same way that we think about the kinds of problems that other scientists study? And I first started thinking about this many years ago, just after I graduated from Cornell, and I was starting my very first postdoc at Columbia, and my roommate at the time, who's now a professor of sociology at Penn, handed me a copy of this magazine called New Scientist. And in it was a book review by this guy, John Gribben, who is a physicist and has written a number of very popular books about physics. And he was writing a book review, a review of this other book that was a sociology book. It was written by this eminent sociologist at the University of Chicago, Howard Becker, and it was called Tricks of the Trade. And the book was about Becker's sort of musings, looking back on a lifetime of doing social science and giving some sort of the next generation some tips on what they should be thinking about. So Gribben evidently hated this book. He thought it was, but he then goes on from sort of trashing the book to trash all of social science, right? And he says, the research that Becker is concerned with is social science, which I thought, and still tend to think after reading this book, is something of an oxymoron, right? Let that seep in. Judging by this book, any physicist threatened by cuts in funding ought to consider a career in the social sciences where it ought to be possible to solve the problems the social scientists are worked up about in a trice. So this is in 1998. And I thought, well, this is interesting. I'm actually going to do just that. Here I am, a physicist. I'm pretty smart. I read the newspaper, so I know sociology. I was sort of very encouraged by this. I mean, I thought it was kind of arrogant and obnoxious, but I thought, okay, he might be right. Well, anyway, so what's happened since then? Well, I wasn't the only one who got interested in sociology. In fact, since 1998, literally thousands of my brethren in physics and computer science and mathematics and so on have become very, very interested in the problems that used to be studied by social scientists. And a lot of this has to do with the web, with the rise of the web and the avalanche of data that has generated, and also this incredible increase in high-speed computing that has allowed us to sort of study questions that would have been impossible just sort of one generation ago. And so you might ask, okay, well, this is far more than Gribben had in mind. There's conferences now, there's new journals, there's massive funding agencies. The European Union is holding a competition now for a $1 billion grant to sort of study sort of big-scale social science. So, I mean, there's a huge effort going underway. And you might ask, well, what about all those problems that sociologists were so worked up about in 1998? Have the physicists managed to solve them? They've had 13 years. And the impact, I think, if you look around, and I'll give you some examples, is actually not very much, right? Advertisers, as you'll well know, still have tremendous difficulty measuring the effectiveness of the advertising campaigns that they run. If we look at government and policymakers, they still have tremendous difficulty. A couple of hundred years after modern democracies began, we still have tremendous difficulty designing and measuring the effectiveness of social and economic policies. The same is true in finance. After a couple of hundred years of modern economic and political theory, we still have tremendous difficulty predicting the next financial or political crisis. After several decades of very, very large scale, very aggressive, very expensive foreign aid, it's still debatable how much impact it has had in many parts of the world. Even at sort of the more prosaic level of predicting the next hit book or movie or company, very sort of experienced people with lots of skin in the game have tremendous trouble making these predictions reliably. And of course, after thousands of years of educating our children, we still argue endlessly about how to do it. So I think the message from all of this is that these problems are really hard, right? They're not just hard for social scientists. It's not just that social scientists are stupid, but even physicists have trouble solving any of these problems. And you might think, well, that's actually obvious, right? This is really, when I think about, the economy, or I think about the education system or the healthcare system, these are very, very large-scale systems comprising millions or hundreds of millions of people and thousands of firms or hundreds of thousands of firms and hundreds of regulatory agencies and government agencies, and they're all sort of interacting with each other in very, very complicated ways. And this is what, outside of sociology, we call a complex system. And everything we know from the science of complex systems, and that, by the way, is what they study at the Santa Fe Institute, and that's why I ended up there, it tells us that these are very scientifically very hard systems to understand. They're very hard to predict. They're very hard to manipulate. And so it shouldn't be surprising that the kinds of interventions that we make as a form of social policy or even advertising campaigns should run into difficulty. Nevertheless, when we think about these kinds of problems to do with people, they just don't seem that hard, right? So we say, okay, fine, all that complexity is true, but if you think back to your undergraduate sociology classes, or you think back to your undergraduate psychology classes, or even political science classes, these problems that you encountered in those classes might have seemed very interesting, and you might have argued about them and wanted to think about them, but they didn't seem hard in the way that problems in your physics class seem hard. And maybe you didn't take physics as an undergraduate, but think about chemistry or biology or or mathematics or any of these hard sciences. Like, those problems just seem much, much more difficult, right? Problems to do with humans, they don't seem like rocket science, right? And so we've actually used this phrase a lot. I see it all the time. This is Bill Frist talking in the New York Times about fixing healthcare, and he sort of summarizes his argument by saying, look, we can do this. This is not rocket science. And this phrase actually is deeply puzzling to me, because the evidence is that we're actually really, really good at rocket science, okay? So when NASA sends a probe to Jupiter, it goes to Jupiter, right? And it orbits, and it takes pictures, and it sends them back, and it does this for years and years on end, and it's perfect, okay? When they tell you Halley's Comet is going to return next month, it is going to return next month, and it will come exactly when it's supposed to come. So we're extremely good at rocket science, and if we could only be sort of 1% as accurate at sort of planning the economy, we'd be doing very well, thank you very much. So why is it that we sort of think, why is it that rocket science seems hard and social science seems like just a matter of common sense? And so the answer that I want to give here, and that I talk about a lot in the book, has to do with the somewhat mysterious nature of common sense itself. So as it turns out, this is a problem that sociologists have been worried about for a long time. Okay, so I'm going to go back now to 1947, and Paul Lazarsfeld, who was a great American sociologist who was at Columbia for many years, was writing another book review. And this was a review of a book called The American Soldier. And this was a study that had been commissioned by the US War Department during World War II. And sociologists went into the US Army and interviewed 600,000 soldiers. Okay, this is sort of massive scale social science, the kind that we don't really do anymore, at least offline. And what these social scientists were interested in was what the experience of life was like in the army for these soldiers. And so Lazarsfeld then gives a list of findings from the book to sort of illustrate the kinds of things that these sociologists found. And one of the results that he cites is that men from rural backgrounds fared better in the army than men from cities. Lazarsfeld then steps back from his review and imagines what the reader is thinking. And he says, look, the reader is thinking this is obvious. You know, men from rural backgrounds, they're used to hard living, they're used to sleeping on the ground, they're used to long hours, they're used to lots of physical exercise. You know, why did I need this vast and expensive study to tell me what I could have figured out using my own common sense? Lazarsfeld says, that's a really good point, except that the results that I told you were actually the opposite of the results that the study actually found. It was city men, not rural men, who fared better in the army. Now, of course, if Lazarsfeld had told the reader that answer to begin with, the reader could also have reconciled it with other things that she thought she knew, right? She could have said, well, that's also obvious. You know, men from cities are used to working in large vertically integrated organizations. They're used to strict chains of command. They're used to showing up to work every day at the same time. They're used to wearing something like a uniform. That's also obvious. And Lazarsfeld then gets to his real point, which is that when every conclusion and its opposite appear equally obvious, of course, once you know what the conclusion is, there is a problem with the concept of obviousness. Right, so this is sort of, this is 60-something years ago, and in sociology, we're still trying to explain this to people. So what is wrong with common sense? And, and I'm guessing that none of you have ever sort of thought that there's anything wrong with common sense. And in fact, when was the last time somebody told you not to use your common sense, right? It just doesn't ever happen. It's universally a good thing. And I agree, there's nothing wrong with common sense. In fact, it is incredibly useful, and the more I've spent years thinking about this problem, and I have gained tremendous respect for what common sense is and what it does. It's extremely useful for navigating concrete, everyday situations. So I look around the room and I notice that none of you have shown up today in your swimwear, okay? Now, possibly later on in the day when some of you may go out to the pool and you'll change, but it's not a tremendous challenge for you when you're getting dressed in the morning to sort of reject the notion that maybe you should wear your swimmers, right? And if somebody did, that person would look ridiculous, right? And but how is it that you know? I mean, there's all these sort of subtleties about the kinds of things that you wear in different contexts, and you don't even sort of have to think about why you're wearing what you're wearing. It's just common sense, okay? The same is true of how we interact with each other. How I'm speaking to you now is different from how you'll chat to each other in the break, which is different than how you'll chat to your children when you go home, and is different than how you'll speak to your friends when you go out with them for a beer. There's all these kinds of subtleties of tone and modulation and volume that we adopt. And if somebody sort of walked into your social gathering a few hours from now and started talking the way I'm talking to you now, it would seem really weird, right? And someone like that obviously doesn't have any common sense, right? I live in New York. We spend a lot of time schlepping around the place on subways and sort of trying to stay out of each other's way and also try to get where we're trying to go. And there's all kinds of sort of subtle rules and norms that go along with navigating your way around the city. And knowing how to do that is just a matter of common sense. Even sort of fairly abstract notions of fairness and self-interest when it comes to economic transactions. How much should you tip? How much, how should you get in line? How should you talk to the guy who's serving you? All of these sorts of things are, there's hundreds or thousands of rules that we follow on an everyday basis, and we don't even think about, how it is that we know what we know. And that's really the nature of common sense. Okay, so what's the problem? This is great, and common sense is super useful, and in fact, life would be unlivable without it. The problem is that it's so good at helping us deal with everyday situations that we want to use it to solve problems, to solve every kind of problem that involves human behavior, even problems that do not deal with concrete everyday situations. So all the examples that I was describing before, like managing the economy, designing a marketing campaign, planning some corporate strategy, even predicting the success of your next product or your next company, these are not everyday concrete problems. Again, these are all problems that involve large numbers of people interacting with each other in complex ways. These people are distributed over very many specific contexts. They are heterogeneous in their desires and their motivations, and they're acting and interacting over extended periods of time. This is not about how to behave when you show up to work in the morning. Nevertheless, when we try to use our common sense to reason about these sorts of problems, and we are indeed tempted to do that, it suffers from a number of systematic errors. Now, this is something that I talk a lot about in the book. I don't have time to go through all of these errors here, and I don't want to depress you too much. But I do want to spend a couple of minutes on sort of the extension of Lazarsfeld's observation. So he observed that, you know, I can tell you one answer and I can tell you the other answer, and our intuition about human behavior is so rich that we can reconcile either answer I give you with something that we think we know. Now, this is also true of very complex events. If we think about, you know, what's happening in the debt crisis in Europe right now, you know, it's very complicated. There's all sorts of things going on, and there's all sorts of possibilities. So there's many things that we think we might be paying attention to. There's many kinds of outcomes, good and bad, that we can imagine, and it's really sort of very unclear to us, right? However, if we look back at the last financial crisis that happened a few years ago, the situation looks very different, right? Now it seems obvious to us that there was a housing bubble going on. It seems obvious to us that poor standards in lending and lack of enforcement of mortgage standards was, you know, destined to cause some kind of problem. It seems obvious to us that mortgage-backed derivatives and the leverage that banks were taking upon themselves was obviously going to cause a problem. And if you put that together with sort of compensation practices in the financial industry, it seems inevitable that we were going to have this crisis, right? So once we know the outcome, we can always go back and pick and choose from among all these many things that were going on at the time to tell this kind of deterministic story, right? If only we'd paid attention to Nouriel Roubini, if only we'd paid attention to Bob Schiller, if only, you know, there were people out there who were saying this is bad, this is going to end in a crisis, why didn't we just pay attention to them and everything would have been fine? Okay, well, there's two things I want to say about this. First, we can always do this. No matter what happens, no matter what the ending is, we can always go back, and there's so many things that could have been relevant, we can always pick and choose them, among them, to tell this kind of nice deterministic narrative that leads to the end that we know happened, right? So this is what we call 20/20 hindsight. What we don't appreciate so much about hindsight is that we can only do it once we get to the end, right? So it's like you're reading a mystery novel or a suspense novel, and all this stuff is happening, and people are coming in, and there are events, and you don't know what the relevance is, and you don't know what the significance of the various things that are happening is, but the author knows, right? Because the author knows how the book is going to end. And the author is deliberately introducing all of these things along the way so that when you get to the end, you have this aha moment and you realize what everything meant. So the way we tell history is really the way that we write stories, the way we tell these mystery novels, that at the end, and only at the end, can we decide what it was that was relevant. So many of the explanations, in fact, just about all of the explanations that we give of complex social events, the things that we read about in the newspaper, they're not really explanations at all, not in the scientific sense. They're really just stories. They tell us what happened. They give us a description of, you know, this happened and then this happened, but they don't actually tell us why it happened. So, you know, there's good reasons why we tell stories. They do help us make sense of the world. They help us sort of get up in the morning and believe that we can change things. The problem with stories is that they're so powerful and they're so entertaining to us and so engaging to us that we're tempted to treat them as if they are sort of scientific theories that we can use to make predictions. And so we look back in the past and we say, this is why this event happened, And in fact, we can learn something from this story that will help us not make that mistake again in the future. And in fact, this is really what George Santayana means when he says those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it. Whenever we talk about what's happened in the past, we are always trying to learn from it, because what we really care about is not the past. What we care about is the future, right? Now, again, this is not always bad. If we get to repeat the same situation many times over, we can in fact learn these sorts of cause and effect relations. And this again is where common sense works so well, because we experience the same situations in everyday life over and over and over again. We can in fact learn what we're supposed to wear. And if you think about when you sometimes go to a new culture or a new environment, you actually do screw up, right? You do wear the wrong thing, you do say the wrong things, you do speak in the wrong tone of voice. And you get embarrassed, and then you learn that that's not what you're supposed to do. And after a while, your common sense adjusts, and you know what the right thing to do is. The problem is, in complex systems, these things that involve like the whole economy or the whole world, history never really repeats itself. Something is always different, something else is always relevant, and this is why we have this phrase, the law of unintended consequences, which is actually a phrase coined by Robert Merton, who was a colleague of Lazarsfeld's back at Columbia. Okay, so here's the audience challenge, and this is a new format for me too, so I'm not quite sure how this is going to go, but I want you to think of some examples where the kind of common sense reasoning I've been talking about, which seems so reliable at the time, has in fact led you astray, and how did you respond to that?
Okay, so new format for Duncan, not necessarily a new format for the iMedia audience. This is where you guys get to speak. You're at assigned tables. So the question is, where has your common sense led you astray, and how did you respond? Tied into Duncan's line of thinking about everything is obvious once you know the answer. So I'm going to let you speak amongst yourselves. Alicia and I will be sitting in, and we'll ask a couple of you to share some of your thoughts back to the larger group. Don't be shy. And if you find it, if you find yourself at a table with just 2 or 3 people, stand up and just make sure that you populate another table so that you're actually having a conversation. You two should move over there so that you're having a conversation with a larger group. Yes. Okay, Duncan, we're gonna wrap up the table discussions now so that we can get back into the rest of your content. I've been sitting in on a bunch of different tables, and I've had some really everybody. Sorry, we're regrouping back. We're going to give Duncan a chance to go through the rest of his presentation, but before we do that, I've been sitting in on some of the table discussions that have been taking place, and they're all really compelling and they're actionable within our interactive industry. So I'm going to go, where did you go? Yes, right here. I'm going to go to this table, table 13, and ask you to just stand, say your name, where you're from, and give a little bit of... There was just a very interesting discussion here about social media in terms of marketing and how that's flipped common sense a little bit on its head from a business perspective. So I'm going to let you share what you guys were talking about.
Hello, my name's Chris Backshees. I'm with Weatherbug, and what we were saying at our table was that what can be common sense to a company, sort of a company's persona, can be flipped on its head with social media. So you made a decision that seemed to make perfect sense about your website or your product, and then you put it out in the marketplace, and social media will feed back to you that isn't right or can be used in 10 different ways than you ever thought of. So I think that opening up to the masses via social networking has changed how common sense can be perceived, depending on what your perspective is.
Okay. And then Alicia, go ahead.
Okay, so
can you stand, say your name, where you're from?
All right, my name is Zach West. I'm from Walgreens, and Chris, you literally stole my thunder. But before we get to that, our first moment was when we got the bacon. We all thought we had a moment where we thought that might have been lunch, and then the soup came and it got better. So nobody else had that moment. But at Walgreens, right, we sell flu shots in the store. You can get a flu shot from a pharmacist. And we started into that business a couple years ago. And the first time we did it, and the first time we went to market with it, you think that how do you get people to come and get a flu shot at Walgreens? Well, you have to make them aware that we have flu shots. And all the marketing, all the conversation pieces, even on social, it was all targeted towards, we have flu shots, get your flu shot. Did you get your flu shot? Who did you get your flu shot for? And what we found very quickly was, and I think I can ask by a show of hands, does anybody ever told anybody about when they got their flu shot? And does anybody normally talk about flu shots specifically in a positive light? So intuition was raise awareness by telling them all that we have flu shots. What we found out was the real way to raise awareness was through some sort of a social campaign that was focused on giving away the shots, giving away people to someone in need, giving the gift of health, and that concept, and make the whole idea about the flu and avoiding it, and not the shot and getting it.
So my name is Nicole Skog. I'm with Spiderlink, and our conversation was really more around, talking about the examples of when it's obvious after the fact, and why, potentially, and trying to come up with why that is. And we talked amongst the group about the example, and it's a horrible example, but the IndyCar race on Sunday. And if you read the Wall Street Journal today, they're talking about all these facts that were leading together. You had a motor speedway that was faster, smoother than ever before. You put 50% more cars on the track. You had a CEO who had come in and was trying to take the company to a more exciting and more dangerous place, and it was kind of inevitable. But it's a lot more obvious after the fact, and so, what does it take to solve that? And we think one is aggregating the data, because you may have different people with different data points, and after the fact, it's easy to look at all those together and how they aggregate. But then also you need someone with a loud enough voice to stop it, and who's willing to stand up and stop it.
All right, some good insight from the audience. Duncan, we're going to let you finish up. I know you've got another whole round of content, so I'm going to pass it back to you.
Great, thank you. Okay, so this is the happy part of the talk. It's by the time you get to the end of the first half of the book, you may be feeling a little depressed. And it's true that we rely a lot on our intuition, and when we think about why people do what they do and how to make them do something differently, we will just spontaneously have reactions, and we will have theories, and they will seem very, very plausible to us, and maybe even inevitable. We'll be tempted to say things like, "Oh yeah, with 100% certainty, this is going to happen," And learning that this is not true can be very discouraging, especially if we rely on it a lot. But the good news is that there are lots of things. Once you do start to mistrust your intuition, there are plenty of things that you can do to learn more systematically about how the world works and how to react to it. And again, sort of going back to my own history about sort of being in the natural sciences and the physical sciences as well as in the social sciences, the one great example that we have in history of how to learn without intuition is the scientific method. So this is something that probably many of you learned in high school, where you start with your hypothesis and then you design the experiment to test your hypothesis, and then you go and you test it. And then almost always your hypothesis is going to be wrong, and so then you modify the hypothesis and you just go around the loop. And it's a very, very simple process, but it has generated, over the last 300 or 400 years, sort of tremendous progress in our understanding of the natural and the physical and the biological worlds. And the claim that I make in the second half of the book is really, we can take this very simple lesson and we can apply it to areas that are not normally thought of as science, in policy, in marketing, and strategy. So then there's like a bunch of different things that you can do. And the first distinction that I want to make is that you have to learn about things that you can predict and things that you can't predict. It sounds like I'm saying that we can't predict human behavior, but actually that's really not true. Not everything is totally random and unpredictable. And the examples of flu shots is a good one, because the whether or not an individual person gets a flu shot in any given year is essentially a random variable, right? But because we're all susceptible to it, you're aggregating this random chance event over many, hundreds of millions of people. And so if you look at, the seasonality of flu trends, it's actually extraordinarily regular. And companies who make flu shots can do a pretty good job of predicting how many they're going to need at different times of the year. Now, we're just outside of Las Vegas, and another great example of where you can predict really well is slot machine returns. And it's sort of a little bit scary that casinos are sort of in the vanguard of, experimental learning. But it's very easy to run natural experiments or randomized experiments using slot machines. And believe me, these things are highly optimized. Don't play them, okay? Is my advice to you. Credit card defaults, search advertising. The weather is actually, at least on a short term, the next 48 hours, weather is actually reasonably, we can predict it with reasonable reliability. It doesn't feel that way because the kinds of predictions that we often want are not the kinds of predictions that we can generate. But weather is something that we can predict reasonably reliably. Okay. Now, when you sort of identify what, the category of things that you can make predictions for, and these sort of, just to sort of summarize, are events that are described by some historical pattern. And many such things do subscribe to an historical pattern, and you can learn that pattern and then you can use it to predict the future. As an article on The Economist said quite nicely, we don't have access to future data, so the only data that we have is historical data, and the question is, when is it useful and when is it not useful? Now, when it is useful, there's all sorts of methods that you can use, and I'm not going to go into detail here. There's statistical models, there's prediction markets, wisdom of crowds, and so on. But the main trap, the thing you really want to avoid, is relying on the opinion of one person. So experts are often derided as being lousy at making predictions. They're actually not that lousy at making predictions. Experts are better than non-experts at making predictions. It's just that when we talk to experts, we tend to only ask one, right? And that's really the problem. So never rely on just one person's opinion, especially when that person happens to be yourself, okay? Because then you're really tempted to take your own predictions seriously. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is something that we never really do. So this is an interesting point. People love making predictions. We all do it all the time. You pick up the newspaper any day. The thing is rife with predictions. Nobody ever keeps track, right? Nobody ever writes down all the predictions that they make and systematically records how good they were. And this is really the thing that you need to do. If you want to know how good you are at predicting, then you have to keep systematic track of your predictions over time. And this is something that you can institutionalize in your organization. Right? If people think they can make predictions, let them make predictions, right? If you think aggregating over all your people to generate the wisdom of crowds is going to work, go ahead. If you have a statistician who can model things, let them do that too. You know, sort of bring everything in, let everything be tested, but keep track. And then you will learn over time what you're good at predicting and what you're not good at predicting, and that will be a useful exercise. Now, here's the thing. There are certain things that we would love to be able to predict that we're just never going to be able to predict. And unfortunately, you know, many of the things that strike our attention and interest us the most do so precisely because they do not conform to historical events, because they're sharp departures from historical patterns. And that's why we find them so interesting. So there we really don't have much help from history. So what do you do then? If you really can't predict these things, what are you supposed to do? Well, the first lesson is not to pretend that you can predict them, right? If you know you can't predict something, don't build a strategy, don't build a plan that depends on being able to predict something you know you can't predict, right? That sounds stupid, like who would do that? But actually we do that sort of thing all the time. You know, companies start up, build strategies that are entirely sort of betting the farm on the next big technological trend. And you know, technological trends are notoriously hard to predict. So maybe you shouldn't do that. Instead, you can use what's called scenario analysis, or many different kinds of variations. Strategic flexibility is another word, to generate lots of different options and think about lots of different versions of the future to expose your assumptions about what's going to happen. And then you can basically generate plans that hedge your risk over all the different possible outcomes. So this is one sort of thing that you can do when you really, really can't predict. The other thing that you can do is just forget about predicting at all, right? So rather than making up a plan that depends on making predictions about the future, just get very good at measuring what is happening in real time and reacting to it. So this doesn't require any kind of prediction at all. So, you know, the example that I talk about in the book is the clothing company, the Spanish clothing company Zara. Zara doesn't actually think it knows what's going to be popular next year. So instead, they send a lot of people out, and they generate lots of ideas. They send out scouts into the shopping malls and the streets and so on. They generate lots of ideas, and then they make lots and lots and lots of designs in small batches. Right? They place a lot of bets, and they put them out in the stores, and they have no idea what's going to sell. Well, they probably have like theories about what's going to sell. They probably have intuitions, but the point is they don't trust those intuitions. They put everything out in the stores, and then they just look, right? And they see what is selling and what is not selling, and then they rapidly scale up those things that are selling, and they get rid of the things that are not selling. And the things they get rid of, they didn't make too much of in the first place, so that's not too costly for them. And meanwhile, this whole strategy depends on being able to design and manufacture and ship anywhere in the world an item in 2 weeks. Okay, so this is really about measuring and reacting. And this is something that Zara was doing before the web came along, but it's something that is much, much more possible in a digital world. The final thing that I want to suggest has to do with this effect called the halo effect. So what does this mean? Well, if we just sort of take the business world as an example, if we look at successful firms, look at Apple, look at Facebook, look at Google, so on, when you read the business literature about these companies, they're typically evaluated as having a visionary strategy, really great, strong leadership, and focused, often laser-focused execution, right? And unsuccessful firms have the opposite, right? They have, they don't have any vision, their leadership is bad, their execution is sloppy. So this is the sort of empirical picture this is how we evaluate firms. Now, the common sense view of cause and effect would be that it's the process that leads to the outcome, that firms that have good processes are the ones that succeed, and firms that have bad processes are the ones that fail. But actually, in fact, it is often the opposite. So this is, there's a fascinating book called The Halo Effect by this Phil Rosenzweig, who's a management science professor at INSEAD in France. And he gives all these fascinating case studies, including that of Cisco Systems, which in the late 1990s, I don't know if you remember, but Cisco was the most valuable company in the world, briefly. And the business press was just falling over itself to sort of praise their CEO and praise their vision and their execution. And then a couple of years later, Cisco's lost 80% of its market value. It's in total disarray. And the very same business press is now writing the opposite set of stories about what a disaster they are. But it turns out it's the same CEO with the same strategy and the same execution all along. And really what's happened is that something has changed in the world that has made a strategy that was successful unsuccessful, and the interpretation of that outcome is that the process was now bad. Right? So this is an effect that has been observed in laboratory studies as well, that people consistently evaluate the process once they know the outcome. Right? So things that lead to good outcomes are always judged as being good. Things that lead to bad outcomes are always judged as being bad. And actually, that's really not necessarily the case at all. Okay, so this is really a doozy of a problem, because if you can't evaluate the quality of a process based on the outcome, what are you supposed to do? Well, here the insight comes from sports. Right? So if you look at something in baseball, if you look at baseball as an example, the batting average is in fact a really great way to measure talent. But the reason is that in a given season, a single player will have hundreds of at-bats and will have thousands, many thousands of at-bats over the course of their career. And each one of these at-bats is an individual and independent test of skill. So averaging over all of those random trials, you really can measure reliably that some people are better than others. Right? The problem is that when it comes to corporate strategy or even advertising campaigns, you often just get one attempt. Right? And when you only have one attempt, a really good idea can fail and a really bad idea can succeed. And it's very, very difficult, it's probably impossible, to estimate the quality of the process or the quality of the idea just from the outcome that it led to. So what are you supposed to do? Well, there's no easy answers here. But I think that, again, in the social media world at least, it is generally possible to build processes that generate many, many observations, that you try many times. You don't bet the farm on one particular approach, on one particular strategy. And then over those large numbers of observations, you really can actually measure that, observe that some people are better than others. And when you have only one observation, again, there's really not a whole lot you can do except resist the temptation to judge the quality by the outcome. And I think we do have a habit of doing this. When we see successful people, we assume that they must have been smart, else why would they be successful? When we see some policy, some government policy fail, we think it must have been a dumb idea because it didn't succeed. But actually, we should resist the temptation to do that, and we should instead look at the idea itself, look at the person themselves, and say, no, actually, that was a perfectly reasonable idea given what people knew at the time, and it just didn't work. And sometimes good ideas don't work. And I think that this is something that is hard to make yourself do, but it's something that you can train yourself to do with enough practice. Okay, so we have plenty of time for the next question, which is really what in your own business could benefit from some of these ideas about experimentation, about repeated trials, about not building strategies that depend on being able to predict things you can't predict, and also how can you avoid falling for halos?
Okay, perfect segue, Duncan. Thank you. So we're all tasked every day with being innovators. So given what Duncan's talked about, the question that I want you all to discuss is what in your business could benefit from a more systematic approach to prediction and or planning, and how can you avoid falling for halos? Okay, so we've had some really, really, really good conversations, and the tables that I've sat in on, from brands to the service providers and vendors who support those brands in terms of their marketing initiatives, agencies included. And I'm going to pass it over to Sean. I'm going to just ask you to stand, say your name, where you're from, and I'm going to shush the rest of the crowd. And so this table had a really good conversation around outside factors that literally cannot be accounted for, and the partners that you work for in terms of advertising success being willing to be fluid with you. So I hope I didn't steal your thunder. I'm going to pass it to Sean.
Sean Cotton from True Media. Our table had a good discussion about, we're in the business of prediction. And we plan and we strategize media and creative to meet an end goal, usually a financial goal. And from the agency side, the client many times will ask, well, how much money is this plan going to make us? And so as we do all the research and we have a plan and we have a process in place, as we go face various factors, like we mentioned the economy of 2008, no matter how good our marketing plan was, that economy was the worst in 50 years. The end financial goals weren't going to be as good as the previous year, most likely. So there's a need, as you brought out, to be able to make adjustments and to optimize, which is what we do all the time in this industry, and not be so focused in on our initial plan that we can't make adjustments when necessary due to these other factors. And to that end, everyone involved with the project needs to be on board with that philosophy, that the plan or the process is fluid, from the client to the agency to the publishers, so that we can react to these outside influences.
Can I just say something?
Please.
Yeah. So I absolutely agree with the point that certain unforeseeable things change plans in dramatic ways, and so that it's important to sort of shift from this kind of deterministic, predictive way of thinking about the future to this more kind of reactive, stochastic way of thinking about the future. But that said, I think that internally, companies, firms, agencies, even firms like mine are generating predictions, like hundreds of thousands of predictions every year. Like everyone involved in a project could be asked, this question, how much money do you think it's going to generate, right? And you could, you can create internal prediction markets, and if you don't want to be that fancy, you can just poll people and say, give me your sort of 90% probability, confidence interval about what you think this is going to, what you think the outcome is going to be, or tell me what you think your prediction is and tell me how confident you are of that. And then you do that for everything you do, and every person has to do it, and you will generate a ton of very useful data about what things you can predict, where you've been good, where you've been bad. Are there people in your company who are really good at making predictions? It's possible that there are. It's possible that no one individually is good at making predictions, but that the aggregate is really good at making predictions, right? That's something that you could learn. And so I think that it's certainly true that you want to be sort of guarding against the things that you can't predict, but you also want to be learning what you can predict.
Okay, so I think that was the perfect soundbite over there. Duncan, you've got a few minutes to close. If you'd like to close now, or we can open it up to Q&A before your book signing.
I have only 2 more words to say. Whoops. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Duncan. I'm going to open it up to Q&A. Alicia and I are around with mics. If anybody has some last questions for Duncan. It's a quiet, tired crowd. Okay, so thank you, Duncan. This was fabulous. As I mentioned before, Duncan will be out signing books right outside of this general session. Duncan, thank you so much for joining us. This was fascinating, and I'm thrilled that you could be here.
Thank you.